Today, the meeting is organized by the Gender Committee of the CIE, and I am Carla Massidda, which coordinator of this committee. The book is Disuguaglianze di genere nell'economia in via di sviluppo. The author is Bina Agarwal. The book is edited by Il Mulino. The Gender Committee of the CIE, besides me, is composed by the following name: Bettin, Casarico, De Paola, Di Tommaso, Ezzo Pasqua, Rabellotti, Silos Labini, which I thank for their help in organizing all our activities. As I said, today the meeting is with our guest Bina Agarwal, and the book is edited by Il Mulino in 2021. Before starting my brief introduction, let me sketch briefly the outline of this session. I will give a very short welcome speech, then Bina Agarwal will discuss some of the main content of this book. A short interview will follow, and then Q&A will be open the floor to the attendees. Now, I take the honor to introduce Bina. We know that she does not need any presentation, but it is a pleasure for me to spend a few words to highlight her brilliant career. Bina is professor of development economics and environment at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester in UK. She has been President of the International Society for Ecological Economics, President of the International Association for Feminist Economics, and Vice President of the International Economic Association. Educated at the University of Cambridge and Delhi, she has held distinguished positions at many universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Minnesota, Cambridge, and she is an elected member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei in Italy. Agarwal pioneered the issue of gender inequality in property and land. In her award-winning book, A Field in One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, in 1994. Among more recent books are Gender and Green Governance in 2010, Gender Challenges in 2016, a 3-volume compendium of her selected paper, and Gender Inequalities in Development Economies, edited by Mulino. Combining academic excellence with policy advocacy, in 2005, she has also led a successful civil society campaign for amending India's Hindu inheritance law to make it more gender equal. Her many awards include a Padma Shri from President of India, the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought, the Lewis Malassis International Scientist Prize, and the International Balsam Prize in 2017 for challenging established premises in economics and the social science by using an innovative gender perspective. Today, as I said, Bina is here to talk about her book, Disuguaglianze di genere nell'economia in via di sviluppo. This book is a collection of selected papers by Bina Agarwal that demonstrate the very many dimensions of her vast scientific production. Today is an opportunity to discuss some of them, some of these issues, with the author, with Bina. So I don't want to take more time. Please, Bina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Would you, yeah, thank you very much. So I'm really delighted to be here. I warmly thank Carla Massidda and Roberta Rabellotti for inviting me to discuss this book of mine, Gender Inequality in Developing Economies. And I'm very pleased that Professor Jazzaro, who's the president of this association, is also here today. Now, this is a selection of my papers, which have been translated into Italian. So the idea of this book actually came from Professor Quadrio Curzio, whom I have known for many years. And he suggested a volume containing some of my key papers in Italian translation. And he put me in touch with the publisher, Monica Albertoni of Il Mulino. So I immediately agreed, since it was an exciting opportunity to share with fellow intellectuals in Italy my ideas on important aspects of gender inequality. What I'll do first is I will broadly describe the central ideas in the book, in the different papers, and then I will share some slides with you after that, or some highlights. Now, we know that although in recent decades, a substantial body of work has emerged on gender inequality, a gender perspective still remains under-examined by most mainstream economists. And even among feminist economists, many important dimensions remain unexplored, I believe in particular, or underexplored rather, in particular, wealth inequality and environmental issues. So this book contains 11 key papers and an afterword. Now the papers are organized around 3 main themes of my research: property, family, and the state, which is part 1. Agriculture and food security is part 2, and then environmental change and community action is part 3. Now, some of these papers are theoretical and others are largely empirical. So I'll share first, as I said, the main ideas. In part 1 is called Property, Family, and Work. And this is, the book begins with what is one of my more important theoretical contributions and fairly well cited, namely on theories of the household. Now, we know that conventional economic theory depicts the household as a unitary model, especially as enunciated by Nobel laureate Gary Becker. Now, this model assumes that all household incomes are pooled, that family members share common interests and preferences, and an altruistic household head ensures equitable allocation of resources subject to a budget constraint. But we know that observed reality is very different. Family members can differ greatly in their tastes and preferences, and a vast body of empirical evidence reveals deep gender inequalities within households in terms of access to assets, education, healthcare, and work sharing. Now, these inequalities cannot be explained by the unitary household model, and they are better explained by bargaining models, which recognize that intra-household interactions contain elements of both cooperation and conflict, and outcomes depend on a person's bargaining power. Now, my contribution to bargaining models is threefold. I argue that a person's bargaining power depends not only on income, as many economists have argued, but also on property ownership, on access to community resources, and qualitative factors such as social norms, social perceptions, and social support networks. Now, women typically have lower bargaining power than men on most of these counts, leading to gender unequal intra-household outcomes. Second, I argue that unlike mainstream economic theory, which assumes that social norms are given, I argue that social norms can themselves be bargained over. And third, I extend the bargaining approach beyond the household to include the market, the community, and the state. All 3 institutions have deeply embedded inequalities. For instance, labor markets have large gender wage gaps. Communities often restrict women's mobility, and women are quite poorly represented in many state institutions. So interventions in one arena can affect women's bargaining power in other arenas. So for instance, if the government transfers resources or cash to women rather than men, then it will enhance women's bargaining power at home. Similarly, if husbands share childcare, and it enhances women's bargaining power in the job market. But one of the most important factors that can enhance women's bargaining power in many arenas, in my view, is ownership of immovable property, especially house and land. So this is a topic on which my research and policy contributions are perhaps best known, namely gender inequality and ownership of property, especially land. Now, I began research on this a long time ago in 1985, when I began work on women's land and property rights. There was no major work on the subject globally. Now, most researchers and policymakers saw employment as the chief indicator of women's economic status rather than property. And economists then working on income inequalities, such as very well-known economists such as late Anthony Atkinson, Professor Amartya Sen, and others, did not focus on the gender gap in property. So I had to break new ground. And I moved beyond the narrow confines of mainstream economics to examine how property defines people's economic and social status, their political power, their citizenship rights, and their sense of identity. The implications of women lacking property affects not only themselves, but also their family's well-being, especially children, as well as the wider economy. So in order to write this book, I drew on law, on economics, on anthropology, and history. And the book was in 1994, it was published then, was called A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia. Plus there were several papers, one of which is in this volume that we are discussing today. Now, A Field of One's Own covered 5 countries. And in order to do that, in order to understand what the laws were, I had to teach myself inheritance laws of every country. And this was very complex because inheritance laws in South Asia vary by religion, by region, and by type of property. So land, for instance, is treated differently from other types of property. And I also examined why there is a gap between law and practice. And then why is the gap higher in some parts of South Asia, like Northern South Asia, compared to South India and Sri Lanka. And I found that an important factor underlying these regional differences was marriage norms. So you find, for instance, that in South India and Sri Lanka, communities allow women to marry cross cousins and within their birth village. Here, parents are much more willing to acknowledge and recognize women's land rights, since the land will remain within the overall purview of the family. But in North India, marriages are with strangers in distant villages, and parents are therefore very reluctant to give daughters land. So this pattern, North-South pattern, also plays out in other gender variables in South Asia, such as in sex ratios, in women's education, and work participation, all of which are much worse in Northern South Asia compared to Southern South Asia. And these patterns are explained better by culture than by religion. But as we know, politicians today are promoting religious identities, denying people's shared cultural tradition. And this in turn undermines the economy. In subsequent research, after this book came out, I found that owning land also protects women from domestic violence. And for this, a colleague and I, we collected primary data for 500 randomly selected rural and urban households in Kerala, which is in South India. And we found that the incidence of domestic violence was 49% among propertyless women, but only 7% among women owning land or house. Employment did not provide the same protection. And this is what I spell out in chapter 3 of the book. In chapter 4, I then look at employment. Now, there's a major debate today on why Indian women's labor force participation has been falling over time. And underlying this, I argue, is lack of jobs for women. There's a lack of demand, and their heavy domestic workload, which affects supply side, and statistical undercounting of women's work. So in particular, women's unpaid care work is greatly undercounted. So this chapter outlines the kinds of data biases we might find and definitional biases as well. And in this, I also provide evidence which disproves assumptions that women are less efficient or productive than men. In fact, in 2011, FAO, there was an FAO report on the state of agriculture, and that collated global studies to show that if women farmers had the same access to land and inputs as men, they could increase their crop yields by 20 to 30%. And country level agricultural output could increase by 2.4 to 4%, depending on the country. So this brings me to part 2 of my book, where I focus on agriculture and food security. And I do it from different angles. So I ask, for instance, are there intra-household gender inequalities in food allocation? How do poor rural families, for instance, cope with food shortages? What is the effect of climate change? What role do women farmers play in global food security? And does group farming offer a solution to small and falling farm size? Now, the evidence on intra-household allocation shows that women bear the brunt of food shortages because they tend to eat last and least in poor households. And sometimes even selling their limited assets if needed to help the family survive. And emerging data from period of COVID, where you see food shortages in many countries, again, you find that there is gender inequality in nutritional foods available to women compared to men. Now, in my work on food security, I extend Amartya Sen's entitlement approach to food security by linking it to my work on intra-household bargaining. And I also use insights from women's coping strategies in past calamities for analyzing the impact of COVID-19. More generally, we know that women farmers are key to global food security because what we are seeing is a feminization of agriculture. But globally, few women own land. So in India, barely 14% of landowners are women. And also 84% of family farms across 111 countries cultivate only 2 hectares or less. So most of these farms are too small to be economically viable. So given this, I asked myself the question, what is the solution to this? And the solution could lie in small farmers pooling resources to cultivate jointly. And in chapter 7, I discussed this idea. In fact, I've been working on this for about 10 years or more. And I'm currently, this is my main direction of research. What I do is that I outline the potential benefits of group farming, such as providing economies of scale, a larger pool of skills and funds, and saving on labor and input costs. And we find that evidence, global evidence also, especially from the transition economies, that group farms have higher productivity than small family farms. So I decided to look at India also for this, and I did empirical work in 2 parts of South India, comparing group farms and individual family farms. And I found that in fact, in Kerala, they had much higher productivity and profits than small family farms, which are predominantly male managed. And they also pooling and cultivating in groups, pooling resources and jointly cultivating empowered women socially and politically. So the third part of my book is on environmental change and community action. And here I move from fields to forests, in particular to environmental change. Now, this is a subject on which I have worked for several decades. We know that sustainable development and environmental governance represent this century's biggest challenges. We know about the conference in Glasgow, and things have only gotten worse. But without a gender perspective, I believe our scientific analysis and policy solutions will be less effective. So in the book, I demonstrate why this is the case in 4 chapters. So first of all, I examine the relationship between women and nature. And here I criticize the ecofeminist argument that women have a special relationship with nature due to biology or ideology. And I argue that this ignores differences between women due to class and rural-urban location, which would affect their dependence on natural resources and their knowledge of nature. So for instance, if you're a city-dwelling person like I am or many of you are, you would know much less about forests than, say, rural women. So instead of the ecofeminist argument, I present an alternative theory, which I call feminist environmentalism. And I argue that both men and women in rural contexts have an interest in conserving nature's resources on which they depend, such as forests. But their dependence is for different products. So for women, for instance, women depend on forests for firewood and fodder, men much more for timber. And so their knowledge of men and women on these different products which they collect differs. So we need policies that increase women's access to ecological resources and enhance their participation in environmental management. And so this paper called The Gender and Environment Debate has been translated into Spanish and French. And now I am also happy that it is in Italian. In chapter 9, I examine the interlinkages between gender, poverty, and environmental vulnerability in rural India, and I focus on interregional and cross-time variations. So for this, I created a series of indices for gender bias, for environmental disadvantage, and poverty, which I termed the gap indices. And then I used the methodology that UNDP uses to create the Human Development Index. So I created a composite gap index to measure variations in gender, environment, and poverty, vulnerability across states and over time. Interestingly, I found that in some states in Eastern India, all three vulnerabilities overlapped and were high. And in other states, such as Kerala, all three elements were low. But in between, in Northwest India, despite low poverty and high prosperity, that region did poorly on environmental indicators and also had a high anti-female bias. In other words, economic prosperity alone cannot guarantee gender equality or environmental sustainability. Now, the final two papers in this third section then address the issue of gender and forest governance from two divergent standpoints. One focuses on women's absence from governance and the other on the impact of their presence. And in both cases, I did extensive primary surveys and fieldwork in India and Nepal. And then in chapter 10, I focused on the women's low presence in community forestry groups and the factors which obstruct their effective participation. And my fieldwork revealed there were 6 factors which obstructed women: rules of entry, social norms, social perceptions, men's entrenched territorial claims, and women's own endowments, as well as the household's endowments. And these, I argue, reduce women's bargaining power both within the household and outside it, and undermine their ability to participate effectively in community meetings. So women's participation could, however, be enhanced if they had enough numbers, so if they had a critical mass. In chapter 11, then, I moved from women's absence in environmental governance to a question which hasn't been adequately addressed. What impact will women's presence have? So in 2010, I had published a book, Gender and Green Governance by Oxford University Press. And in this, I address many dimensions of this question, including the impact of women's presence on rulemaking, rule violations, conservation outcomes, and equity. And I also tested for critical mass, and I found that the figure of 25 to 33% mattered. So as we know, 1/3 has long been used globally by women's groups to lobby for seat reservations in parliament, but it has not been much empirically tested with rigor. So in this, I was able to test it. The question then is, if you have a critical mass of women, does it make a difference to conservation outcomes? And so in chapter 11, I actually used the primary data that I had collected in India and Nepal to test it. Now, collecting this data was not easy because there were serious security risks in Nepal, and we administered 9 types of questionnaires. We used diverse methodologies, including satellite data to assess forest condition. And the results were striking. So forest protection groups, which had a critical mass of women in the executive committees, showed significantly higher improvements in forest condition in both countries. So including women helped improve protection efforts and brought women's knowledge of local ecology to enhance biodiversity and regeneration. So in the long term, of course, we must frame policies to reduce rural households' dependence on forests for sustainability. And therefore, we need to move away from firewood wood for house building, and to move to clean natural gas to replace firewood for cooking. Now, the book ends with an afterword in which I give which I ask what kind of gender analysis has most effectively challenged mainstream economics. And I suggest some answers. I note that most effective challenges are posed where the initial thrust is theoretical. There is a strong potential for formal modeling and empirical testing, and where the results demonstrate significant efficiency and equity gains that justify policy shifts. So by these criteria, bargaining household models explaining intra-household allocations have provided one of the most effective challenges to mainstream economics. Now, it'd be interesting to know if you agree with that. And then research on gender inequality in labor markets and on property ownership have also effectively challenged mainstream, the aspects of the mainstream, and opened up new pathways for analysis. So this gives you a broad idea of the three parts of the book, and I'll just highlight a few aspects by showing you some slides. And for that, I'll screen share with you. So here you can see that this is the table of contents. As I had said, there are three parts to the book: property, family and work, agriculture and food security, and environmental change and community action. And then there is the afterword. So, sorry, it's not moving. Okay, so there's the first part is property, family and the state. This is the contribution on bargaining and gender relations. And as I mentioned, there are four arenas of bargaining. There is the household, the community, the market, and the state. And in the center, what I show are factors which affect bargaining power, including property ownership and social norms. So if women get support in one arena, suppose the state supports them, or then it would have an impact on their intra-household bargaining power. Similarly, if they do well in the labor market, that would affect intra-household bargaining power. And the opposite is also true. That if women, if they don't have supporting spouses, then they may end up doing all the care work, and that will have a negative effect in the labor market, and in turn affect their position in the household. Now, so this slide then talks about my 1994 book, and this data is more recent. And here, as you can see, there is vast gaps in gender inequality in property. In Asia, 4 countries other than India, only 14 to 37% of all landowners are women. In India, 14%. This is some recent work I had done. In Africa, across 10 countries, this is work by other scholars, 22% was the average. And in Latin America, again, you see there's huge inequalities. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at South Asia, is that I'd mentioned there is a connection between social norms and gendered economic outcomes. So here is this first map is village endogamy, which is wherever it's green, it's better. And the green part of it indicates that the social norms allow you to marry within the village. And that means that land can remain within the extended family, and you yourself are more able to control it. Similarly, you find a very similar map. You can marry across cousins. Whereas in this region, in both cases, where it's white, it's forbidden for women to marry within the village or anybody related to them across many levels. And you can see that this north-south comparison also shows up in legal rights in property in the 1990s. And you have somewhat similarity in female labor participation. So this is quite striking if you look at South Asia, that how culture and economic outcomes overlap in very interesting ways. Now, subsequent to the book, I then did work, as I'd mentioned, on women's property status and spousal violence. And here I've just given you a crosstab where you can see that the incidence of violence was 49% among propertyless women if they had no house or land, and dramatically lower, only 7%, if they had both. So we can talk about this more in the discussion. The second part of the book is agriculture and food security, and this this diagram simply shows you that you get a feminization of agriculture over time. If you take this period over several decades, you find, except in Europe, everywhere else you find that the proportion of females to males in the total labor force has been rising. Now, this means that the women farmers are extremely important. And this is what was emphasized in the FAO 2011 report. It showed that because of despite the fact that large numbers of farmers are women, because of the gaps in access to inputs and land and credit, crop yields were much lower, often for women than men. But if you bridge that gap, then crop yields could rise very significantly. And but most farms are small. Women don't have access to land, and so this demonstrates really that this is one of my papers of a series of papers where I ask this question: what if you pool land, labor, and capital and pooled collectively? And here we find I looked at the relative annual value of output and net returns from group farms and individual family farms. Most of these are male managed, and you find that this is group farms have 1.8 times the annual value of output and 5 times the returns of compared to individual family farms. And the third part of the book, I'm just giving you some highlights, is firstly on women's exclusion. And if you see this picture, it was taken during fieldwork, and I don't know if you can spot the women, but I'll just give you a hint that these are only 2 women in a large community of men. And typically, you'll find that the women will not speak if there are so few. However, if you increase the proportion of women to a critical mass, which I examined in this book, Gender and Green Governance, then you find that it can make a significant difference to various outcomes, but particularly to forest conservation outcomes. And we are particularly interested in that in the context of climate change, because forests sequester carbon. And then I just want to add that, of course, drawing on forests is not a long-term answer, and it is extremely important that we find alternative materials both for cooking and for building. And so this is an example of an old kitchen with lots of smoke, very unhealthy and environmentally polluting. And here is a biogas plant, which is methane gas, which can be constructed in any village and in any household. And finally, this is the afterward, where I discuss what factors can enable us to feminist economics to challenge mainstream economics. And I had already shared this. It is where the thrust is more theoretical, where you have a potential for formal modeling and testing, and there are significant efficiency and equity gains, and then you have a potential for policy shifts. And I discussed in which areas you do find they have been effective. So I hope with this volume will give Italian readers a flavor of some of the key dimensions of gender inequality, both in developing countries and more globally. Although my empirical examples are mainly from developing countries, I hope the theoretical insights have more global resonance. So I look forward to the responses from all of you and from my Italian colleagues. So thank you.
Thanks, Bina. Thanks you really for your outstanding presentation. It gave us a clear idea how important are the topics you have covered in your extensive and original research. And exactly now, I would like to go back to some of them with some questions.
Okay.
As you explained us and you told us in the first part of your book, you also discuss about intra-family dynamics, and you have argued that against the unitary family model in favor of the Berganian approach. Can assuming different models also lead to different policy outcomes?
Yes, I believe it will lead to different outcomes, and I'll give you something very simple. Suppose the government wants to transfer cash, make cash transfers to poor households, and we know that in many countries it's been doing so under COVID-19. Now, if it assumes a unitary household model, it would simply transfer the cash to the male household head, assuming that the benefits will be shared equitably among all the family members. However, if policymakers recognize that intra-household allocations depend on relative bargaining power, then they would transfer the cash, say, to the senior woman member, thus increasing her bargaining power. And in turn, we also know that the resources that are transferred to women are much more likely to benefit children and the whole family than if they're transferred to men. So policies which are based on the bargaining model, I believe, are more likely to be able to be gender equal and more equitable, and also more effective.
Thank you, Bina, for your answer. And staying the first part, you also deals with domestic violence in India, as you said. What can we do about it, since it will not disappear only with, as you said, only with economic development? What can we do about that?
Right. Actually, with economic development, most inequalities don't disappear unless you act on them. And domestic violence is endemic, not just in India, but globally. So we find it both in rich countries and in poor countries. And what we do find is that most countries have strong laws against domestic violence, but they're often not very effective because, firstly, women hesitate to report domestic violence. They blame themselves for it. But even if they do report it, many women have nowhere to go. So for instance, you have shelter homes in many countries. I'm sure you have them in Italy as well. And that's a temporary relief. Now, what my research with the colleague which I mentioned demonstrates is that if women own a house or land, it not only gives them an exit option, but if violence occurs, but it can also deter violence. So in the figures that I shared, the incidence of domestic violence was dramatically lower if the woman owned a house or land than if she didn't. But other factors also matter, of course. Support from local NGOs and neighbors also helps. And interestingly, violence is less if the spouse is employed rather than unemployed. But in terms of what we can do, I think we have to go beyond just laws and shelter homes to much more long-term solutions to deter violence rather than deal with it after it occurs.
Yeah, thank you, Bina. It's a big lesson also for Italy as well, and for all the West and Eastern countries. I mean, it's unfortunately is a very spread phenomenon about domestic violence. Very sad topic. Now I'd like to move to the third part of your book, and in your research, you have analyzed the impact of female participation in forest management and environmental resources in general. Can it also lead to improvement in conservation and biodiversity? And if so, how? I mean, does it work in both ways? In both ways, the relationship?
So, women in developing countries are the main users of forests. So they use it for getting firewood, for fodder and food items. And you'll be surprised how strongly dependent women in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia still are on cooking, on firewood for cooking fuel. As a result of this, on the one hand, they have extensive knowledge of the local ecology. And so they have a strong stake in conservation and in biodiversity. But despite this, we find that for instance, in community forestry experiments in Asia, women have been largely excluded from forest management, with some exceptions. So in my research, I had examined that if you include women, then it can actually make a significant difference to conservation outcomes, especially with a critical mass of 25 to 33%. So why is this the case? What I found was that including women increased the numbers of people who are actually protecting the forest. So they would make their own patrol groups. And also, if you excluded them, they were more likely to sneak in and if you're not party to making rules, you're more likely to break the rules. And also because their knowledge of local ecology could be used for regeneration and biodiversity. So all those were factors. The more inclusive you were, and especially including poor women, made a particular difference, I found.
Thank you.
So it's one of those rare cases where you have a win-win in terms of policy outcomes.
Exactly. Okay, that's exactly the question I had. I was interested in this more two ways relationship between women participation and environment conservation, because it's a topic of international debate, not just dealing with poor countries or developing countries.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We know, Bina, that you are currently working on cooperation among small farmers and to overcome problems of small farm size in South Asia. And you talked today about this issue. What are the advantages of group farming for women in particular?
Right. Thank you. First of all, we need to remember, what is group farming, you might ask. So, people can cooperate in farming in many ways. Sometimes they just cooperate for marketing or buying inputs. But group farming is much more fully integrated cooperation by pooling land, labor, and capital. And what we find is that across globally, a very large proportion of farmers are very small and not economically viable. So generally, if you pool your land, labor, and capital and do group farming, it could help economies, bring in economies of scale. It can save on hired labor. It can increase the pool of funds and inputs. And it can also bring in greater diversity of skills and leadership qualities. Now, these advantages, of course, can be for both men and women. But for women, in addition, groups can help them overcome restrictive social norms. So women often hesitate to go alone in markets. They're not very effective. But they go in a group, they are much more effective. Empirically, as I showed you in that slide in Kerala, that all women's group farms were extremely effective in raising productivity and profits compared to the individual family farms. But also there were other capability outcomes. So women learned to manage farms and they were much more respected within communities. They were able to participate in local elections, and many of them have won local village council elections. So the impact has been both in economic terms, but also socially and politically. And I believe this could transform farmers' lives if we talk about post-COVID Build Back Better.
Thank you, Bina. Thank you, Bina, for your answer. I have just one small last question, but last but not least, as your work has had enormous policy impact, especially on the issue of women's land rights, which is also now a target among UN Sustainable Development Goals. To what do you attribute this success?
Well, you're right. I mean, my most influential work has been on gender and land rights, but also there's been an impact on gender and forest governance, and now on group farming. Now, I can only suggest some possible factors. I think, firstly, the strength and originality of the idea itself matters. So, for instance, when I wrote A Field of One's Own, I covered uncharted territory. So I argued that gender inequality in property, and not just employment, was the single most important factor affecting women's economic situation. And I made a case for women's land rights independently of men, not only to improve welfare, but also improve productivity. So what happened was that the idea seemed novel, and so the media picked it up. There were a lot of TV and newspaper reviews and TV interviews, and it caught the attention of policymakers, who then, there were several chief ministers in India who then put it into their program for action. The second thing I do systematically is I take my research to civil society. So I hold workshops for NGOs. I write in much simpler terms. I do sometimes do booklets, like I did a booklet on Are We Not Peasants Too, which is used for training, and it was translated into multiple languages. So that helps. And then I also write for newspapers, so when I do a piece of research, I also do an edit page piece, and that gets attention as well. So I think my general point is that it is not enough for us as economists to publish in good journals, which of course we must do within the academe, but also for the ideas to have impact more broadly, we need to put in time to take it to multiple fora, of which I find writing for a newspaper is quite effective. And then finally, in one case, I directly intervened in policy because I led this campaign to amend the Hindu Succession Act in 2005 to make it gender equal, partly because I'd learned so much, I'd done so much research on the laws that I knew the law well. And we were effective. So now for 80% of Indian women who are Hindu, the inheritance laws are gender equal. So, that's broadly what my understanding of it is.
Thank you, Bina, and thank you for your answers and for your speech and presentation. It was really very, very interesting. And we are lucky we have 10 minutes more, so we can give the floor to the audience. We have my colleagues of the Gender Committee that are joining this session and are here together with us, Silvia, Maria Laura, and Roberta, and Alessandra, Maria. All of them are Julia, in the committee. So if they want to have a space and want to make you question, they can obviously intervene. But also from the audience, they can use both chat and Q&A. And
Professor Alberto, in case he has.
And Professor Alberto, he's the president of the CIE, so sure.
I have some question, if I can raise. I'm
Please,
very interested on, if I understood, you find that for India, the intra-household bargaining is the main determinant is property instead than income. I would like to understand what exactly property capture, because I don't know if you distinguish between different sources of property, because sometimes you have inherited property, or other times is earned property. So if you have inherited property, probably what matters is the parent's family that is very strong, the strength of a parent's family that determine the capacity of women to have bargaining within the household. While in case of earned property is of course income that allowed female to acquire property. In the same way, I don't know exactly, but probably in rural area of India, land is the main source of income. Therefore, it's pretty difficult to distinguish between property and income in terms of what give exactly intra-household bargaining.
Yes. Shall I answer that? So let me clarify. My argument is not that property is more important than income. Initially, when you look at the early interventions on the collective models of the household in the early 80s, the focus was particularly on income. And so what I argue is that you have to go beyond income. Not that income doesn't matter, it does matter, but you have to go beyond income to look at other factors, of which ownership of immovable property in particular is important. Then common pool resources, which is public property, is important, and then social norms and social perceptions. So my argument was that you have to broaden the scope. And secondly, you have to look at the interactive effects of extra household situations on intra-household bargaining outcomes. So I think that answers part of your question. I think the question of how do you get property. So first distinction I make is between immovable property and other kinds of property. So land becomes a very important productive resource for rural incomes. Whereas if you just have some financial resources, it won't have an impact. But land is also symbolically very important for people. As you know, you can spend more litigating and keeping a piece of ancestral land, even if its economic value doesn't justify it. And in inheritance laws in India, if you go back to the 11th, 12th century, they make this particular distinction between whether women should own immovable land or movable. And typically women were given dowry in terms of movables, small animals, jewelry, but they were not given land. And so this historical disadvantage, which goes back a long way, as I said, 11th, 12th century legal treatises, continues even though you have reformed the laws. But in practice, people still give immovable property and not movable property to women, and not immovable property. So I hope that that puts it in the right perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto, for your questions, and thank you, Bina, for the answer. We have Silvia that wants to.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick, maybe a complicated question, but it's about violence. Because I wonder, I know that the situation in poor country is dramatic, but what you said is that development, economic growth does not change, even if income increases. Women are still victims of violence, and rich countries are an example of this. In Italy, we have this incredible problem of violence against women. And as far as I know, this is not something that is limited to poor people in rich country. We have couples of middle and high classes that in which women are victims of violence. So I wonder whether we can think about factors that can protect women against men violence within the family, which is the main problem. It's not the violence in the street, it's the violence in the family. So which are the, if we can identify, if you can suggest some factor that can explain this in order to identify which policy we can implement to protect women against their husband and partners. Thank you.
Okay, shall I take Maria's question also and then do it together, or?
Maria,
Carla?
yes, sure.
Yeah.
Maria
Thanks.
Laura, please.
Hi, Bina.
Hi.
I have a general question, maybe more on also a comment to follow up Silvia's question on domestic violence. Yeah, in Italy, the problem of domestic violence, violence against women, is huge. And in addition to what you have said, Bina, that when there is an effect, if women's income increase or they own property, domestic violence decrease, there is also actually a backlash effect for women who earn more than men. Then in some of these cases, there is a backlash because men feel that they can't control the partner anymore because she's earning more than him, and therefore there is a way, domestic violence is used as a way to gain power again over the woman. So this is also something I wanted to ask you if you,
yes,
in your research, have been looking at this, but I'm sure you have. And the other thing is that since you wrote your seminal book on A Field of One's Own in 1994, given that, you know, you have a huge experience on gender and development, what are the main changes that you have seen in these decades, in the last 3 decades at this point, 2.5, almost 3?
okay, thank you. So those are all great questions, and let me try and provide some answers. Firstly, although it is true that domestic violence is endemic and universal in some ways, but there are differences. So you find that the degree of it, the incidence of it, from, you know, firstly, data is quite limited for it, but WHO does publish data, you know, because it's seen as a health issue, and you find that the proportions are, the incidence is less in overall in developed countries than in developing countries. So for instance, this figure of 49% is huge, 49 to 50%, whereas you find that it's much closer to 10% or 15% in developing countries. So improvements in incomes does make a difference, cross-country averages. And secondly, between rich and poor, some factors become, on some factors there is improvement. So for instance, take COVID. Now during COVID, in very poor households, you had a lot of crowding in within 1 or 2 rooms, and you find there was a huge amount of tension in domestic violence. And there's some research which shows that as you increase the number of rooms in the house, you actually reduce the likelihood. So I would say that that we do need to make some distinction between being well off, where you can deal with it, and the incidence would be less. But it doesn't solve the problem. Now we make a distinction between what can be called proximate factors, but they're not causal factors. So proximate is the man says, oh, well, you haven't cooked this well, or you've done this, or you've done that, your housework you haven't taken care of, or the child is ill, it's your fault. So you have all these which are supposed to be proximate factors. But, and there's a lot of literature on these proximate factors, that you're not playing the role you were intended to play as a good wife, as a good mother, as a good worker. But if you go into more fundamental factors, and I feel ownership of property is one of those fundamental factors, then that is extremely important. But let me broaden it and say, if women have an exit option, so within a broader approach, if you don't have an exit option, you're stuck, with violence. Now, the exit option can be provided temporarily by shelter homes. Women run shelter homes. But in the long term, the government needs to provide some kind of alternative housing. And I think in Europe in the 1970s, they did try and do that. They provided council housing for women who were, and there was a lot of demand by women's groups to have alternative housing for women who were victims of domestic violence. So I believe we need to look at structural factors, because if you have an exit option, then the man knows that the woman can leave, and that can also deter violence. So this is the best I can offer on the basis of my empirical work, but I think it does require much more empirical work. And if there's a group in the neighborhood who the husband knows will act if he beats up his wife. So social support systems do matter. NGO support systems do matter. The two other questions. So Maria, the issue of perverse effect, I did look at it. And what was very interesting is that employment, if the woman is better employed than the man, it actually can lead to higher incidence of violence. So that is a perverse effect. That's the backlash effect. But if the woman has property and the man has none, there is no backlash effect. So that's very interesting. So one might say he doesn't want to lose the property, or he knows she has an exit option, which is stronger. The employment perverse effect is very interesting, because, if you look at Amartya Sen's capability approach, you would say if a woman is educated, she's employed, she has higher capabilities. But in domestic violence, what you see is relative capabilities, and relative capabilities don't always go in the direction of an improvement in absolute capabilities. I think that is an interesting conceptual shift which needs to be made. And finally, what has changed after A Field of Unsown? In terms of women owning property, I've just got a paper out which was published in April called in the Journal of Development Studies, in which I found that despite improvement in laws in terms of ownership, very little has changed in terms of ownership of property. But what has changed is an awareness of women's rights. There's huge improvements in women's education. There is increase in life expectancies of women. There is a huge decline in maternal mortality. So if you look at the other indicators of well-being, then you do find there's an improvement. But on this particular front, I'm afraid on property, much more needs to be done than has been done so far.
Maybe like in the gender pay gap, women in Italy, for instance, or in many European countries have much higher education, but they earn less in general. So when it comes to money and property, more difficult to tackle inequality.
That's right. And here I want to bring in Alberto's point that, if you look at lifetime earnings, suppose you don't depend on inheritance and you think that, okay, I will earn enough to buy property. If you look at the UK, you find that the pension incomes of women are less and their lifetime earnings are less because there are inequalities in the labor market and there are gender wage gaps. So not only is not being able to inherit a problem, but there is also a problem if you have inequalities in the labor market, in your ability to acquire property through the market. So if you improve, for instance, women's position in the labor market, reduce the gender wage gap, as there's been a lot of effort towards that, then perhaps you'll move towards women being able to acquire property even if their family doesn't give them any.
Thank you, Bina. Thank you, Maria, Silvia, Alberto, for your questions. It is 7 past 14, so we are a little bit behind the time we thought to have for this session, but it doesn't matter because all issues and topics were so important. So I can ask if there is someone else that want to highlight some more issues, some question more. I don't see any questions in the chat and Q&A. So I think that we can conclude this meeting, and I want again thank you, Bina, for your participation on behalf of Alberto, which is here, so the CIE and the entire CIE, and especially from the Gender Committee of the Italian Economic Association. I also want to ask to thank all participants. We were quite a lot, but someone has already left, but never mind. I will thank them on the chat. So we have finished today, and I hope this is just the first occasion to collaborate and to meet you, Bina. And so I look forward to meet you again.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I've enjoyed interacting and the questions, and I hope, as you said, that we will have a chance to meet again, both intellectually and in person.
Yes, both.
Thank you.
I hope to.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Silvia, Maria. Thank you very much, Clara, Carla. Thank you.
Thank you.